History is a race between education and catastrophe. So said author H.G. Wells, and I think that sums up my experience with 2006's Eternals revival. I hunted these books down because I was curious, and I hoped to educate myself so that I could better educate others. In the process, though, I feel like I've uncovered a comic book catastrophe. At this point, we know all of the basics. A long time ago, gigantic aliens called the Celestials came to Earth, where they found proto-humanity. Inspired, they tinkered with their DNA and created two new races, the monstrous Deviants and the perfected Eternals, while leaving the rest of the human population to evolve at their own pace. The first two groups clashed over the fate of the third. The Eternals called their space parents in, and the space parents spanked the Deviants until their continent sank into the Pacific. Except for one of the Celestials. The Golden Celestial protested the destruction of the Deviants, and, for its rebellion, it was imprisoned on Earth. The Deviants fell into history, while the Eternals began to shepherd humanity and were looked upon as gods. And that's just how things were for a long time. At least, until the machinations of the Eternal Sprite screwed things up, which is basically what we've been exploring in these past 4 episodes. We now know the broad-stroke history of the Eternals, and if my goal was to prime you for the upcoming film release, well then I would say that I've done so. I'm sure that there are going to be lots of changes between the comic book source material and the eventual movie we're going to get, but I'm fine with that. That's just the basics of how this works, and now you know the basics of how the comics work, dear listener. And for the most part, I have to say that the basics here work. Reading Gaiman's Eternals, I was immediately entertained. Like, the first issue kind of blew me away in how simple and immediately relatable it was. I was drawn in easily, I like our varied cast of characters, I like the scope of history that is in play, and the concepts that includes. I like Gaiman's treatment of the Deviants, or, as they self-identify, the Changing People, and I like his focus on making these characters more science fiction characters than science fantasy characters. John Romita Jr.'s artwork is, for the most part, clean, and he draws both the real-world mundane parts of the story well as he draws the cosmic giants, or the monstrous Deviants, or the strangely attired Eternals. I love Romita Jr.'s facial close-ups. He does a very good job when he takes the time to draw and sculpt a face. He does like to use a lot of little sketch lines, and I'll admit that doesn't work when you zoom all the way out. Faces tend to get a little mashed potato-y, but when he does zoom in, it is great. It's fantastic stuff. The basics of this story are all built on the details, though, and it's there that Gaiman's story starts to fall apart. Sprite's rewrite of reality, the very act that sets this particular story in motion, lacks details and has very mixed consequences for our comic. The overall story isn't one story at all, with a clear rise in action that builds to our ultimate threat. No, instead this book has like 2.5 stories that shape it. While our overall cast is charming, they do lack depth and motivation and almost any sense of coming together as a team or a group. And this book is called Eternals, with an S at the end, as in plural. As famous and skilled as author Neil Gaiman is, and as much as I love the other works by him that I've read, I honestly feel let down by Eternals. What went wrong here? How could it be fixed? And where does our story go from here? My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 17.5, Eternals, Lessons from History. Perhaps the single weirdest thing to me about this story is its structure. Now, to be fair, Gaiman is a fantastic author with a laudable history, and writing Eternals is about the closest that I think he's ever come to just writing a classic, straight-up American superhero comic. Most of the rest of his works are much more fantasy-inspired, and most of them are novels, so the expectation from the audience is going to be different. Going into a comic book, I want a clear, concise story that entices me to read more. In long-form ongoing series, this used to be done through more of an A to B to C plot-style structure. The A plot was what a particular issue was focused on, the B plot was what was going to be focused on in the next issue, and the C plot was either then introduced or just simmering in the background. Once you resolved the A plot, the B plot would move up, you would update the C plot to the B plot, and then you would introduce new plot elements, and you would do this continually for, if you were lucky, decades. However, in the early 2000s, the popularity of manga brought new readers into bookstores, and Marvel and DC started to see improved sales of their trade paperbacks, or the collected reprints of their comics. Both companies began to restructure their books, asking their authors to write in arcs. Now, instead of writing about 6 different threats with numerous plot elements over the course of 6 issues, which was basically how Chris Claremont wrote Fantastic Four Volume 3, authors would write 6 issues built around one threat or single storyline, with maybe some background elements that would carry over to the next story. Instead of each single comic book needing to read like a complete story in and of itself, now a single comic book could just be one part of a whole, chapter 1 in a 6-chapter book. This is referred to as an arc because the story should arc. It opens with the beginning and introductions to the story's main ideas, it rises to a climax which should challenge your lead character with some kind of action or growth, and then it wraps things up at the ending. It is an arc, it is a beginning, middle, and end that is classic writing structure. You would think that this would lend itself to Gaiman's particular writing style, but look at this thing. Our first 3 issues ultimately build to a failed kidnapping at a party, our next 3 build to the Golden Celestial, and our final issue barely explores Makari's new role as Skadrak and sets up the Eternals' new status quo. Ignoring our strict plot elements, what are our characters' arcs? Mark Curry goes from tired medical extern to a superpowered Skadrak, but this story doesn't ask anything of him. He doesn't do anything. There was no challenge that he had to overcome, no growth as a person that he had to go through. That's not an arc. That's not even a chapter style of writing. It's just weird. A well-executed arc should blend all of its story elements together, not just have them move at different speeds and then resolve at different times, and maybe some of them have nothing to do with anything else that's going on. For example, Gail Simone's Secret Six miniseries, which we covered back in episode 6.2, does this extremely well. That comic is perfectly balanced, as all things should be. How so? Well, let me recap. The Secret Six miniseries features a still fairly new team of mercenaries in the DC universe who are attacked at the start of the book and nearly killed. One of their members, Knockout, is badly wounded, which greatly angers Scandal Savage, her partner. The team then works together to find and defeat their assassins, eventually tracing the money back to the ultimate bad guy, Vandal Savage, who it is revealed is Scandal's father. The group ultimately confronts Vandal, overcomes a bevy of personal issues, and establishes themselves as Scandal's new family since her biological family sucks so bad. Vandal Savage, as the main bad guy, isn't just a threat to Scandal, but to the entire team. Defeating him isn't just an act of personal growth and catharsis for Scandal, as she overcomes her fear and respect for him, but doing so also lets the rest of the team demonstrate their strong feelings for her. As an overall story arc that is easy to understand, it has clear emotional stakes for our main character, Scandal, while also having emotional stakes for the rest of the cast. That is efficient and balanced as hell! And the book features solid background plots for the rest of its cast. Scandal's desire to not become her father is reflected in Catman's struggle against his own personal nature as a hunter, but his desire is to be a better person and to do good deeds. Deadshot cuts his partner and daughter out of his life in order to protect them from his enemies. This in turn makes him more protective of the family that he now has in the Secret Six. Everything in this book ties together, and it is amazing! Seriously, go buy Secret Six. It's the best thing that DC has ever published, and no swearing. You Batman fans and Superman fans, I don't care what you have to say. The best Batman story that I've ever read still has nothing on the Secret Six as a whole run. Eternals, by contrast, does none of the things that Secret Six did. The kidnapping of our first 3 issues was orchestrated by Druig, so okay, he's the one who is going to awaken the Golden Celestial, right? No, he actually plays no role in this book almost whatsoever. Well, then, Sprite was the one who orchestrated the downfall of the Eternals and made them human. Maybe now he'll be motivated to stop the Eternals from coming back, and then they would reassert their dominance over him and force him to be an immortal again. No, that doesn't happen. Other than explain how the Eternals got not eternaled, Sprite plays almost no role in this book whatsoever. Well, fine. It turns out that the Changing People were hired by Ajax to set all of this in motion. Does Ajax have a villainous plot? No. Do the Changing People have a villainous plot? No. Well, the Golden Celestial is our biggest threat, right? It's the Super Shredder of TMNT 2's Secret of the Ooze. Surely it is going to do something. No. This is a book that builds to nothing. It doesn't build at all. It doesn't even really build on the legacy of what Jack Kirby, Peter B. Gillis, Walter Simonson, Chuck Austen, or even Bob Harris wrote before. It just continues it. The Eternals stopped existing for a time, and the world didn't seem to care, and now the Eternals exist again, and they do nothing to show why the world should care about them. I don't know how you do that as an author. How do you write a story that is so utterly unimportant to the very people that take part in it? This is like if Neo reached the end of the Matrix without realizing that he was the chosen one, and then when he went to fight Agent Smith just stopped, and then the movie ended. Gaiman's overall story is built out of 3 elements: the history of the Eternals, its characters, and the plot that delivers them all. It is ultimately the failure of these 3 elements to come together that makes Eternals just a frustrating read. Obviously, part of this series' job was to recap the existence of the Eternals, and I actually think that Gaiman does that part of this narrative very well. The summation of the Eternals' broad history was great. It was fast, epic, concise. Romita Jr.'s artwork looked great, and it fit in with the previous established history of the Eternals well. In terms of representing old information, Gaiman and Romita Jr. did a good job. However, covering the history of the Eternals also means explaining the gap between the 1985 series and this one, and that is a big part of where this book fell apart. Gaiman basically created the Golden Celestial as a plot device so that Sprite's altering of reality could happen, and even that idea, honestly, is fine. I don't think that we're ever given a hard number of Celestials in existence, so inventing a new one is fine, it's no big deal. I do have to admit that for the course of this series, I did rename it. Throughout this comic, Gaiman referred to the Golden Celestial as the Dreaming Celestial. But long-term listeners of this show know that another Celestial was called the Dreaming Celestial, and it showed up during Chris Claremont's Fantastic Four Volume 3. There is no relation between the two of them, and they are not the same character, but I wanted to avoid any possible confusion anyway. To be clear, they could have been the same character. Claremont never established a solid reason for his Celestial to be exiled on Earth, other than the other Celestials fearing its power. Plus, it was resealed in its tomb in the American Southwest at the end of Fantastic Four Volume 3, Issue 25. It wouldn't have been that hard to retcon in the idea that the apostate did the same basic things that the Golden Celestial did to get exiled, and that was why it was exiled and then imprisoned. The two concepts are so similar that they could easily be merged together, but Marvel clearly wanted this book to stand on its own, despite its ties to eternal history, so I can understand why they didn't do this. Also, Fantastic Four Volume 3 is pretty forgettable, and I bet that no one remembered a Dreaming Celestial existed inside of it anyways. I'm sorry, Fantastic Four Volume 3. I wish it wasn't so, but it is. The existence of the Golden Celestial isn't the problem here, though. No, the real problem is how Gaiman executed Sprite's plotline. I really, honestly love Sprite's motivations and actions. Like, for real, I totally get why he did all of this with all of my heart. But Sprite turning the Eternals into humans, and remember, we're told that Sprite rewrote reality. He didn't cast an illusion, he didn't trick them into thinking that they're human. Sprite made the Eternals human. And therein lies a lot of my problems with this. Some of the Eternals, like Ajax, have their eternal memory from the start, while others have memories but not understanding, like Ike Harris, while others remember bits as dreams, like Mark Curry, and others remember them only in the most vaguest sense, like Thena Elliott designing weapons that she remembers from being an Eternal, despite not remembering being an Eternal. And then we have characters like Druig and Cersei, who show no indication that they remembered their past at all. In fact, Druig outright tells us that he was trying to do good deeds, which goes against his very nature. Why do some Eternals remember and others don't? Along those same lines, Ike Harris is shown to have amazing recuperative abilities. He heals from so much damage before he ends up getting killed by Morjack and Gelt of the Changing People. But if you're telling me that these people have been human for any length of time, none of them have noticed a healing factor? Thena blinded herself with that flashbulb in issue 1, but wouldn't a healing factor have helped her recover from that faster than expected? She is a weapons-developing scientist. She would be running tests and trials to see how effective that thing is and how quickly people could recover from it. It was designed to not damage people's eyes. She would know if it had a different effect on her. It would actually almost be a neat hint at her origins if she made sure that her guest wore glasses in order to protect them from its effects, but then she says she's okay with exposing herself because in testing, the effect wears off on her faster than on the test subjects. She could even just brush it off as a joke, like, yeah, I guess I just recover quickly. But no, instead this plot point is just inconsistent. I also brought up this basic complaint before, but if Ike Harris is a human being, why can he recover from such drastic damage? He doesn't think that he is human, and he shouldn't be able to recover from the kind of drastic damage that is done to him by the Changing People. This kind of background inconsistency litters this narrative, and I could probably accept one or two plot details being a little not quite lining up-y. I could live with that. I could just brush those off and go, he screwed this up, I don't care. But at this point, this is just so many that this isn't one or two things. This is a bunch of things, and we're not even done. We can see these kinds of flaws in the characters themselves. Many members of our cast get new names like Ike Harris or Mark Curry, which hint at their real names and is fine, but some of our cast only have the one name, like Cersei. And why? Why does Tony Stark remember Cersei and her being an Avenger, but his computer system doesn't? How can Thena have a multiple-year-old child with a husband and a job working for the government, and then for Tony Stark, without someone doing a detailed look into her background? And I bring up the kid thing because Sprite wanted to age past being 11. He outright says this, which means that his de-eternaling of everyone would have had to happen within a year ago. But Thena has a child who is at least, 2 or 3. As a medical extern, Mark Curry would have needed to go to medical school, which takes time. Druig was a member of a political party. These aren't positions that you just walk into. Having those positions either indicates a total and complete rewriting of reality to include these new humans in it, or an incomplete story by the author. And I think you know which way I'm leaning at this point. But Ben, Sprite is 11 years old. Surely he wouldn't have planned all those little details out when he did this rewriting. I would argue that his bastardization of their names is exactly the kind of thing that an 11-year-old would do, as are those structural holes. You remember some of those story ideas you had in junior high. There are echoes of these writing elements in those ideas, my inner geek is arguing. But the problem with that is that Sprite isn't 11 years old, he's 500,000 years old. Zurus even points this out to Sprite at the end. Just because Sprite looks like a child doesn't mean he is a child. I would even argue that's Sprite's point. Plus, Sprite specifically tells us that he took the time to plan his move out. There is no good reason for these mistakes, and I would buy that Sprite screwed up if that was what Gaiman was going for. You know, like when the hospital goes to investigate Mark after he releases Ike, have the hospital call him and then fire him because he lied about his medical history or his medical training. And then when Mark talks to Sprite about all of this weirdness happening, Sprite would laugh and be like, oh, my bad, dude. I didn't even think about that. Sprite, as an unreliable creator, would work fine, and it would be an excellent way to explain away all of these kinds of inconsistencies, but that is not what Gaiman said or did within this story, so ultimately, I have to place the blame on him. Sprite's manipulations are a solid explanation for why the Eternals are human. I'll totally give Gaiman that, and it actually does fix my biggest overall complaint about the concept of the Eternals. It takes these inhuman gods and makes them human. I complained in a previous episode that the Eternals are about the least Marvel Comics idea that's ever been published by Marvel Comics. Stan Lee made it a point to have heroes who were flawed or who faced everyday problems in his stories. Sometimes that's as simple as Professor X having this beautiful dream of coexistence and a powerful mind, but he can't fight for his dream to become reality. He is confined to a wheelchair. Or the Hulk has this incredible strength, enough to defeat almost any foe, but that strength also ostracizes him from the world. There's always a great trade-off that Marvel's characters get in exchange for being superheroes, and that adds depth, characterization, and weight to their stories. But the Eternals don't follow this idea. All of them are fit and handsome, they can't get sick or die, they're generally cut off from humanity because they live separately, and they're hard to relate to because their society is literally so alien. Superman at least has the drama of wanting to be human, of wanting to be a normal, accepted part of society, and the Eternals don't even do that. They live in grab-dangle Antarctica, for crap's sake. How much more removed can you get? Until this series. The characters that we're introduced to in this book are human and have lived human lives. Sprite is an aspiring TV star, Mark is a medical extern, Thena has a son and a husband, Cersei can't hold down a job. We can relate to these ideas and to these people. We understand their lives to some degree. Mark's slow discovery of his powers over the course of our first 3 issues is perhaps my single favorite background plotline of this comic, as it feels the most realistic, and thus it is the most relatable. In fact, with only a few narrative changes, Mark's introduction could end with him being a mutant fairly easily, and welcomed into the X-Men. I bring that up because the X-Men as a concept works, it sells, and it has been selling comics for over 60 years. But the Eternals books don't sell. There were only 39 Eternal comic books sold since 1976 at this point, almost 40 issues in 30 years. That's an idea that just doesn't sell. So making this cast human adds a factor of relatability that could save this concept and make it viable for long-form storytelling. It could also serve to add some stakes to their adventures. Gaiman gives us the idea that the Eternals can be continually reborn, resurrected through the machines at Olympia, and that's cool. It's an idea that's so cool, actually, the X-Men books are currently stealing it. Right now, even if an Eternal died, they're fine. They come back to life and nothing has changed, as Makari states at the end of our series with Craw. Kill me and I come back. Who cares? Whoop-de-freaking-do. But if you don't care, Makari, why should I care? What are the stakes to any conflict that these characters can face? That is the ultimate flaw here, but with a slight tweak, it could put a human cost to an Eternal's death. If Gaiman had set things up that coming back to life would restore the Eternals back to their last existence and threaten to wipe away their memories of being human, essentially killing their humanity, that's got some legs. If you put a gun to my head right now and said that if I was killed, I would come back to life but minus the last 10 years of my life, but I would still be alive, I wouldn't be able to go through with that. I've changed as a person in the last 10 years. I've grown over that time, and I wouldn't want to lose the friendships and connections and self-revelations that I've had. Now imagine that you're Thena, and the thing that you would lose is your emotional connection to your child, who you gave birth to, and you nursed, and you raised, and you've had these tragedies and triumphs and joys. Rather than charge onto a bridge and break it in order to stop the deviants and die, well, now you might rethink your options. Or it could be a good way to demonstrate how important a particular objective is if an Eternal is willing to give up a life lived in order to accomplish it. That still requires you to be invested in that Eternal's current particular lifeline, but it's still better than nothing. I would like to add that Gaiman doesn't really flesh this cast out too much, but given the sheer size of the cast and our basic inconsistencies, this doesn't surprise me. It disappoints me, but it doesn't surprise me. I feel like I have a pretty good handle on Cersei's and Sprite's motivations, which is funny to me because they are easily the least heroic characters of this bunch, but I really don't have much on the rest of these people. Icarus is a driving force of our narrative. He's the one who pulls Mark into this adventure. He's the first one to rediscover himself as an Eternal. He's the one who is pushing to stop the Golden Celestial. But why does he do any of this? At first I thought that he was just trying to solve the mystery of his memories, but once that question is answered by his rebirth, then what? Why does he go to Thena, who Ike Harris never visited or bothered, actually, instead of Mark Curry? Why does Thena choose to go along with him? The story kind of tells us that the Eternals are programmed to do these things. They're hardwired to protect the Earth and save humanity and not harm the Celestial, but if that's the case, then they aren't people, they're robots, and all the work done to make them human doesn't matter. If you want to go with the idea that the Eternals are programmed to do certain actions, then make the human part of their story being their rebellion against that programming. Self-determination is one of humanity's greatest skills, and the right of all sentient beings. Thank you, Optimus Prime. So use that, man! The Eternals could show up to stop the Celestial, but then they freeze, or they go into comas, or they just can't punch it, whatever, so they're forced to figure out a way around that. Have them attack the Celestial, and then it blasts them or whatever, but Cersei sat the attack out because she doesn't want to be a superhero. But then she's like, wait a minute, why don't we call the real superheroes? And then she calls Tony. And then the Avengers show up, and then they have to stop the Celestials, while the Eternals, I don't know, fight off the changing people who swarmed into San Francisco in order to worship their god and receive its blessing. That would demonstrate that the Eternals may not be able to physically harm a Celestial, but they can still oppose them. They can still work around their programming despite how powerful it is to them. It also vaguely shows how unimportant the Eternals are to the Marvel Universe, that you could call the Avengers to handle this problem and they would do just fine, but that's a totally separate problem that would need to be addressed a totally separate way. Gaiman's fix for making the Eternals more relatable is a good one, although flawed, and I feel like a lot of my complaints would be addressed just by paring the overall cast down. By the end of this book, we've got 8 Eternal cast members, and that is a lot for any comic book. The only other books with casts that large that sell well are the Avengers or the Justice League books, and half of those casts star in their own titles. If Gaiman had kept the focus down to just maybe Makkari, Icarus, Cersei, Thena, maybe Druig or Sprite as like your phase 1 bad guy, and then you would have to totally rewrite the book, but somehow transition their narrative into the threat of the Golden Celestial, I think that this would have worked better. We don't honestly need Zuros or Ajak at all. And Druig's most interesting plot elements is his takeover of Varro's Haika, and that doesn't tie into this story at all, so let's drop him, baby! As much as it pains me to say that, because I really liked Druig's plot elements in this. The only way that casts this large work is if the audience is already super familiar with them or they have very simplified character traits. I would be okay with an 8-person cast if our main story starring Makkari was a satisfactory one. Sure, introduce the others, establish them as part of this, but then keep a tight focus on Makkari's growth as one example of how a human handles being turned into an Eternal, and then later on, you can explore the rest of the cast in greater detail. This series does get a follow-up ongoing series, so clearly that could have been a thing. There are still our background characters to address too, by which I mean Morjack and Gelt, and by extension the Changing People, the Golden Celestial itself, and the Avengers. And I won't lie, I kind of love Morjack and Gelt. There's this relaxed air about them through the whole book. They're clearly meant to be the comedic relief, and that part of the story works well. What's surprising about them is how human they feel. I knew going into the Eternals that the Deviants were like their main bad guys, and I was honestly expecting them to be the main threat of this book. So to find Morjack and Gelt just so likable, and I dug the scene with Craw in issue 7 too, so I guess finding the Changing People so enjoyable was a real surprise to me. Gaiman does an interesting job making them feel like a society. They can communicate and reason. They have human skin suit disguises for some reason, but that implies a level of technology. They can write and they have religion. They can create viewing screens and spy cameras and energy weapons. The Changing People might look like monsters, sure, and they clearly have little regard for human life, but they also aren't mindless beasts. The Changing People, and our two main characters from them, do suffer from the same kind of problems that the rest of our narrative does. A lack of background details. Ajax hires Morjack and Gelt to kill Ike Harris, and his payment will be releasing their god. But if you can kill Ike Harris, why not just threaten to kill Ajax so that he'll release the Celestial? Ajax seemed really concerned about reneging on his end of their deal, but none of the Changing People ever call him out on it or hold him to task. How did Morjack and Gelt get to San Francisco? Why did they even go to San Francisco? How did they know to go there? Did they know that Mark Curry was Makkari? And if they knew where the Celestial was already, because you could argue that's why they went to San Francisco, and then they knew that they needed an Eternal to wake it up, and we know that because they tell us, then why didn't they just kidnap Mark Curry to begin with and take him to San Francisco? Or, when they kidnap Ike Harris, take him to San Francisco? They had Ike for at least a day, if not two, while they were torturing him. There was plenty of time to get him to San Fran before anyone was the wiser. This just doesn't make sense. And after the Celestial is awake, it does nothing in reference to the Changing People. There was no great rising up in power or lifting up at all. And how does their society take this? Their flooping God woke up, and it doesn't care what happens to them. That has to be a thing. The Changing People then lay siege to Olympia in issue 7, and I can't help but ask, if they knew where Olympia was, why not destroy it while the Eternals are gone? Or lay some traps? About the only thing that I particularly like about the Changing People is this Skadrak concept, which I believe is new to the Eternals mythology. I really enjoyed the whole confrontation between Makkari and Craw. The idea that Morjack and Gelt would return to their people with news of Makkari's actions makes sense, as does the Changing People wanting to follow up on those stories. As a warlord, Craw undoubtedly has greater weight in their society than these two randos, so him having come back confirming Makkari as Skadrak will legitimize Makkari's new role. That is smart. And despite his hope of fighting only Makkari, Craw was aware of how the Eternals feel about the Changing People, and so he brings an army, just in case there's a fight. And it's a good thing he does. If it had been just Craw, he probably would have been fried in minutes. Craw might look like a big dumb monster, but he's not. He is a skilled, seasoned warrior with a honor all his own, and I love that. I also like how Makkari settles this fight. I love that he references the idea that killing him has no weight. Sure, chop off his head and take it home, he'll be back. It doesn't matter. But beat him in a fight, win his allegiance forevermore, now that matters. That has some weight to it. This is also why Makkari offers Craw his neck instead of just punching him. His real goal in this wasn't to kill Craw. He seems pretty anti-killing in general, as demonstrated by him asking Circe to save Morjack and Gelt. He only wanted Craw defeated, and so he traps Craw with his own honor. Craw couldn't strike Makkari again. He agreed to hit Makkari 3 times, not 4. If Craw had killed Makkari, sure, he would have taken his head home, but he would have done so with no honor. And for a warrior of Craw's stature, that is a perfect trap. At first, this solution didn't really fit with my perception of who Makkari is. He isn't really a riddle type of guy. But thinking about the entire run, Mark Curry has been intelligent, logical, and quick on his mental feet. We saw him pretend to be the editor of a magazine at the Varro's Hike-In party, and he pulled it off fairly successfully, so clearly he can think and talk fast too. This moment is an extension of that, and I super appreciate that the human element was getting recognized here. I would have appreciated Makari's motivations for saving Morjack and Gelt getting explored a little bit more, though. We know that Makari was a medical extern. He clearly has some amount of medical training, so my guess is that Mark, as a person, just values life. I don't know if an extern takes the Hippocratic Oath or not to do no harm, but I like Makari working to preserve life no matter whose it is. It's honestly the first time that someone in this book feels like they did something heroic and not just something that they had to do. Or does Makari's concern stem from him being a creation of the Celestial, and so he shares its concern for the changing people? Is Makari programmed to be concerned about them, or does Mark Curry just want to save lives? What does Makari being Skadrak mean to our overall narrative, actually? Because I have no idea. Will the changing people be more open to the Eternals from here on out because of him? Will Makari act as a bridge between their two people, perhaps smoothing over some of their long and troubled history? I'm not honestly looking for this book to answer those questions. I would expect that to be explored in the follow-up, and I like that those questions are getting set up here. This is a really good mystery to be explored, and it leaves lots of room for that, where the rest of the questions that I feel like I've been asking are more about things in the past, and they will never be addressed. I would have liked to have seen the changing people in a more central role as antagonists in this story, but I'll fully admit that desire is shaped by my old knowledge of Eternal lore. Most of the work that Gaiman does here is to give them more agency than just, monsters are bad, monsters must die, and I have to say that I think that's really cool. It's a lot harder to critique the Golden Celestial as a character for a number of reasons. Part of that stems from it only appearing as a being with agency in one issue, so that's not a lot of time to develop anything. But then we also have the fact that it's kind of our final bad guy, so we need to fear it, but then you have to take into account that it's also a million-years-old alien. How much of our human experience is comparable to what it has experienced? That is a hard thing to write. But Gaiman tried, so I gotta cover it. As a threat, the Celestial works well, until it's actually active. Seeing it lying in the ground, the Celestial is enormous, our cast is very small in comparison, and all of the crackling energy around it feels scary. I can hear it snapping and popping in the air. When it's uncovered, though, and its armor turns golden, I won't lie, it loses a lot of that scariness. Gold isn't a color that humanity associates with bad. It is bright, shiny, warm. These are things that we typically associate with being good, although I will give Romita Jr. points for giving it a big ol' creepy grin. The Golden Celestial has two large, mostly rectangular eye outlines and the red outline of a mouth, but it looks like it has a grin just with like huge teeth like a cartoon character or a jack-o'-lantern. I was actually quite disturbed when it applied its face to Cersei's body in Mark's mind, so that's great. Again, we're supposed to be scared of this thing. Gaiman works in some subtle character through the Sleeping Dreamers. The monologue that they're delivering is basically the Celestial's thoughts and origin story. This gives us a crash course on its past and its motives. It created life and things were good, its fellows turned on it, and once imprisoned, it grew bitter. At first, it had planned to reward whoever freed it. Then it would spare only them from its wrath. Finally, it would kill them first. The Celestial imprisonment actually had a mental effect on it, which I think is great, but then it wakes up, and it's not mad at all. You've been seething under the earth for 500,000 years, and all it takes is seeing Iron Man to cool your jets? Okay, sure. And this is something that Gaiman's story relies on throughout it. It is these vague promises of big ideas and scary threats, but when it comes time to do one of those threats, it shirks back. Everything in this story feels almost like half-written and anticlimactic, like I said earlier with the Neo and Agent Smith metaphor, and it's just super frustrating. The Avengers have this weird role to play in this story, as they really need to be here. Part of the push for this book was to reintegrate the Eternals into the main Marvel universe. No longer would they be isolated in their own corner, ignored and shunned by every other book and crossover that was happening. Given Iron Man's then current role as the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the top cop in general of the superhero world, it makes perfect sense that he would be the point man on this story. But if you're going with the idea that Tony remembers Cersei and her history as an Avenger, why wouldn't Tony call in an expert and bring in Dane Whitman? Dane Whitman is the Black Knight, and in the early 90s, he and Cersei were one of the Avengers power couples under author Bob Harris. Why add in Dane and add in another cast member, Ben? Because one, he is human and then currently not an Avenger, so if Cersei just wants to live a normal life, she could have one with Dane. But two, Dane does part-time it as the Black Knight sometimes, so he could also be the thing that draws Cersei back into superheroing by association. And three, Dane wasn't currently featured in any book at the time, if I remember correctly, so Gaiman could have had total control over the character, unlike Iron Man, who ultimately has to go back to his own ongoing series, and the Avengers book, and the Civil War event, and multiple guest appearances, and everything else that was tying in at the time, on and on and on. I would also add that 4, Dane Whitman is as perfectly useless as any of the rest of the Avengers that did appear ended up being. Dane, after all, is just a guy with a sword. What is he going to do against a half-mile tall Celestial? And that is the frustrating flip to the Avengers being here. They didn't need to be. Iron Man, Yellowjacket, and the Wasp accomplish nothing when they show up in issue 6 other than eat up panels and ultimately get sidelined. Like I brought up last episode, I think that Gaiman wrote them this way in order to make the Eternals look competent. But then the Eternals do nothing to actually stop the Celestial, so they don't look competent at all. They honestly look just as useless as the Avengers. But if you're cementing the Eternals in the Marvel Universe in 2006, there is no group more important or influential as the Avengers. It makes sense that they would investigate the seismic readings in California. It makes sense that they would investigate the Celestial. It makes perfect sense that they even want it gone, but then they don't do anything. If you want to show how competent the Eternals are, have them stop the Golden Celestial in some way that's better than what we currently got, but then have the Avengers show up, and they're like, oh hey, these supervillains must have put this giant robot here to take over the world, we better fight them. And then the Eternals have to fight the Avengers in order to protect the Celestial, despite not wanting to do so. Even they know that this thing is a threat, but they can't let any harm befall it. And then, rather than do a big pile-on 2-page spread of these two groups fighting each other, send only Makkari or only Thena to defend it. Have one of these warriors single-handedly defeat the mother-loving Avengers. And suddenly they feel competent, don't they? They feel powerful. They feel dangerous. Which better illustrates that Iron Man can't do anything to stop them or force them to join the pro-superhuman registration side. Maybe it would even motivate him to come up with some anti-Eternals solutions that you could then explore in the next volume of the book. That could be interesting, yes? Or at least more interesting than what we got. This volume of Eternals was just meant to get them back on the Marvel Universe stage. And it did that. I would argue that it didn't do it well, but we have a kinda limited cast, we have a basic understanding of who they are and what they do, and we have some interesting threats to explore, including Druig in Varos Haika, any revenge that Sprite might want once he's back to life, the lingering threat of the changing people, a space god is just squatting in Golden Gate Park, and we have the inevitable arrival of the cosmic locusts called the Horde. Gaiman gives the following book a clear mission statement here at the end: find the other Eternals. And that's really not a bad place to launch an ongoing series from. And eventually, that's what Marvel did. Issue 7 of Eternals was published in March of 2007, and in August of 2008, over a year later, the Eternals would return in Volume 4. This particular series was written by authors Charlie and Daniel Knopf and launched with artwork by Daniel Acuna, although it finished with artwork by Eric Wynn. I didn't pick this volume up when I bought this volume because, honestly, I didn't think that the Eternals were an interesting concept to begin with, and I wasn't sure if I would even like these comics. On the one hand, I do kind of regret that decision, because now I kind of want to see if Volume 4 follows up on any of the ideas that Gaiman lays down, or does it just do its own thing and rocket off in a completely different direction. But, given that I just spent a whole episode picking this book apart and crying about how much it doesn't work, I also think that ultimately I'm fine missing this one. Volume 4 of Eternals would end up lasting for 9 issues and 1 annual, making it the second shortest ongoing series that the Eternals have headlined so far. Marvel did launch a new volume of Eternals in March of 2021. It was originally scheduled for a 2020 release, as was the movie, but the COVID-19 pandemic shut both of those things down, and Marvel held off on releasing it. Written by Kieron Gillen with artwork by Esad Ribic, I have to say, this volume of Eternals was immediately more intriguing to me than any previous volume, because I absolutely love Gillen's writing. Seriously, he is one of the most thoughtful, most character-focused writers in the industry right now, but he can also tell a great long-form story. He's written amazing independent books, he's written amazing for-hire books, and he actually wrote a book about gods and pop culture for Image Comics called The Wicked Plus Divine, so he was a natural pick for this volume. So far, the book is really relying on Thanos' connection to the Eternals. He's a genetic cousin, it's a long story in and of itself, don't worry about it, but the characterization in it is already strong. Gillen has made a point of using the long existence of the Eternals as a way of exploring who they are, and how each one interacts with and is shaped by the world, so that's actually pretty cool. He even breaks the machine that resurrects them right at the start of his run, giving any potential deaths more weight and meaning. It's only had 4 issues published so far, it's still really early into this run, and that's why I didn't cover that series, but I have to admit that I'm enjoying it so far. The 4th issue, it's kind of losing some of its ooh, this is new and things are happening kind of steam to me, and I'll fully admit, I'm kind of over Thanos as a bad guy for a while, but otherwise it's a really enjoyable read, and I've been having a good time with it. I will be very surprised if it makes it to a full year, but I will enjoy this book for as long as it lasts. What a series. I feel like I just finished running a marathon with this book, and it was only 7 issues long. Why was this so hard? Why couldn't I have just loved you, Gaiman's Eternals? In any case, we are done with that. Let's move on with our lives, because I know that I'm ready to. I am eager to see how Marvel adapts this kind of story to the big screen, and to see how well they do it. They've done a pretty good job with most of their movies, but I also feel like that they've really taken the time to set up and establish who most of their characters are, before they threw 8 or 9 of them into one movie at the same time, so this is going to be a tricky thing to juggle. Anyways, you don't care about that, you want to know about what's coming next. Well, first off, I'm going to take a week off. I know that we just had a skip week 2 weeks ago, and I'm very sorry that I want to do this again, but I took that skip week because of mental health issues, and I basically want to take it for the same reason. I just fought my way through a field of depression, lethargy, self-doubt, and burnout, and I don't want to have to do it again. I want our next string of episodes to get published and released without issue, in one go, and just have it be nice and steady for everybody. I want that stability as much as you guys want that stability, and my brain just hasn't let me engage in it recently. So I'm going to take a week off now, chill out, and then come back strong and ready for the next series of episodes. And I know that I'm coming back strong, because I've already chosen the series for my next streak of episodes. And I'm excited about it. I have been asking myself since I started doing this podcast when I would talk about cross-gen comics, and when I did finally talk about it, which book would I want to talk about first? How do I want to present it? I have gone back and forth so much over what I wanted to do with this, and that's ultimately why I haven't done anything, and I've decided to say, screw it! I'm just going to jump in. What? You've never heard of cross-gen comics before? I figured you might be in the dark on that one. That makes me sad, but it does not surprise me. So join me in 2 weeks as I break down the history of cross-gen comics just to get you caught up. And then the week after, things are going to get medieval in episode 18.1 of Scion. High fantasy meets high tech. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.